Our children, Archie and Lily, are just 6 and 4 years old. Can you believe it?
The palace had believed the silence to be permanent and the distance to be carefully controlled. But then the phone rang. It was neither a routine call nor one intended for negotiation. What came through carried urgency, consequence, and a warning that could not be ignored. In that instant, all carefully maintained assumptions collapsed, and the institution realized it was no longer ahead of the story. The call arrived just after dawn, at a moment when the palace expected the day to unfold like so many before it. Briefings were being reviewed, overnight media summaries had already been marked and set aside, and nothing on the schedule suggested any disruption. Then the secure line rang unscheduled, unplanned, and not routed through legal counsel. The call did not come from a diplomatic office or a trusted intermediary. The name that appeared on the internal screen froze the room: Meghan. For a split second, no one moved. In an institution trained to anticipate every possible scenario, this was not one of them. The palace had grown accustomed to distance, to silence, to carefully managed separation, but this call cut through all of that. The receiver was lifted, the door quietly closed, and notes were taken by hand, not digitally. Within moments, senior staff were alerted without explanation, only urgency. From the first words spoken, it was clear this was not a courtesy call. Meghan was calm but not tentative, controlled but unmistakably serious. She did not ask how anyone was, reference the past, or open with emotion. She opened with a warning. Those listening immediately understood this was not about reconciliation or grievance, but about timing, about something already in motion, about consequences that could no longer be delayed or managed quietly. The atmosphere shifted from curiosity to gravity, the kind that settles when people realize a line has already been crossed, whether acknowledged or not. What unsettled the palace most was the absence of dramatics. No anger to dismiss, no tears to reframe, no escalation to label as instability. Meghan spoke with precision, each sentence carrying intent, each pause suggesting calculation rather than uncertainty. She was not asking for intervention. She was informing them of the risk. As the call continued, aides exchanged glances without speaking. One began marking timestamps, another reached for a folder that had not been touched in weeks, and a third quietly left the room to alert someone higher up the chain without waiting for permission. The palace had heard many difficult calls over the decade's crises, scandals, collapses, but what made this one different was the direction of pressure. This time, the institution was not reacting to the press. It was reacting to the person it had believed was already contained. When the call ended, no one spoke immediately. The silence that followed was heavier than the conversation itself. The silence of recalculation, of realizing that assumptions made months earlier were no longer safe. Finally, one senior aide broke it with a single, quietly firm sentence. This changes the timeline. Within minutes, protocols shifted, briefings were halted, communication staff were told to stand by without explanation, and legal advisors were quietly contacted not to prepare statements, but to anticipate what was already in motion. The legal advisors were not contacted to draft statements, but to assess exposure, because whatever Meghan had just said had done something the palace could not undo. It had placed responsibility back inside those walls. And once that happens, the story is no longer about distance. It becomes about what the palace chooses to do next. Why she called now can only be understood by looking beyond the calm that had recently settled around her public image. From the outside, it appeared as though the long chapter of tension had closed fewer statements, fewer confrontations, a sense that distance had become permanent and therefore manageable. But inside that quiet, something else was building. For weeks, Meghan had been receiving subtle signals that escaped public notice, but were unmistakable to someone attuned to the workings of institutional silence. Messages were acknowledged without substance, assurances delivered without follow-through, and conversations that once moved quickly now stalled. None of it was overtly hostile, that was the point. Detachment is how institutions prepare themselves. It creates plausible distance and allows outcomes to unfold without fingerprints. Meghan recognized that pattern immediately. What troubled her most was not what was being said, but what was no longer being corrected. In recent days, a shift in tone had begun to appear across multiple platforms, not through dramatic headlines, but through careful framing. Language that softened responsibility, phrases implying inevitability rather than choice, stories that stopped short of accusation, but left just enough space for assumption to harden. To the casual observer, it looked like routine commentary. To Meghan, it looked like the early stage of narrative transfer, the moment when accountability quietly moves from institution to individual. Meghan had lived through similar situations before, but this time the stakes were higher. What was forming was not just a media narrative, but a convergence of legal, reputational, and security concerns that were beginning to overlap. Each on its own might have been manageable. Together, they created a situation where timing mattered more than intention, and waiting carried risk. There were also external pressures the public never sees. Third parties whose interests did not align neatly with palace restraint, advisors who calculated exposure in days rather than years, and media ecosystems that rewarded escalation over accuracy. Meghan understood that once these forces aligned, the window for quiet correction closed quickly. That was the first reason she called. The second, more personal and decisive reason, stemmed from a long-held expectation that if she remained silent, the institution would act with proportional care, that certain lines would not be crossed, that some internal awareness would act as a brake even without public defense. That confidence had eroded over time, not in one moment, but through a series of small realizations. A meeting that did not happen, a clarification never issued, a decision that moved forward despite unresolved concerns. The message was unspoken but clear. The institution was protecting itself first, and in doing so, it was preparing to let the consequences fall elsewhere. Meghan also recognized something the palace could not afford to overlook. Silence no longer protected her, it protected everyone else. Each day she remained quiet. Assumptions filled the space, and delays made it easier for others to claim ignorance later. The longer she waited, the harder it would be to demonstrate that warnings had been given. The call was not an emotional reaction. It was a strategic decision. By calling directly, she bypassed the filters that slow. By calling directly, Meghan ensured that information could not be delayed until it lost urgency. She created a record that could not be dismissed as rumor or interpretation, making certain that specific people heard specific concerns at a specific moment in time and action that matters in institutions built on documentation and precedent. She was also clear, though not stated outright, that she would not carry what came next alone. For years, the expectation had been that she would absorb fallout quietly, allowing narratives to unfold while she remained distant and therefore easy to frame. That expectation no longer held. Meghan was not threatening exposure. She was establishing shared awareness, a subtle but profound difference. If events unfolded as she anticipated, there would be no question about who had been informed and when. The palace would not be able to claim surprise or ignorance. That was the moment the balance shifted. The call was not about reopening old wounds or revisiting past grievances. It was about preventing future damage that could not be undone once public. Most importantly, it was about reclaiming agency. By calling when she did, Meghan moved herself from the margins of the story back into its center, not as a subject to be discussed, but as an actor shaping what came next. She understood that the palace responds differently when it knows it is being watched by history, not headlines. That understanding dictated the timing of the call. Not later, not after confirmation, not once damage was visible. In moments like this, timing is not everything, it is the only thing. The palace's response did not arrive with raised voices or visible panic. It arrived in silence, in stillness, in the subtle but immediate reordering of priorities. When the call ended, there was no rush to issue statements or consult outside voices. The first instinct was containment. Information was narrowed, not expanded, and only a small circle was briefed, chosen not for rank alone, but for discretion and reliability. Those brought into the room understood the significance instantly. This was not treated as a personal matter or a public relations concern. It was framed as a structural risk. Internally, the language shifted. Words like narrative and optics were replaced with responsibility and exposure, signaling the seriousness of the warning. Every detail of the call was reconstructed, not just what Meghan said, but how she said it. Pauses were noted, the order of points analyzed, and the fact that she did not ask for reassurance was discussed at length. In palace culture, that absence speaks louder than demand, suggesting certainty rather than speculation. One of the first actions taken was procedural review. Ongoing plans were quietly paused, drafts pulled back for reassessment, and advisors asked to identify decisions made under assumptions that might no longer hold. Nothing was cancelled outright, but everything was questioned. Legal counsel was consulted early, not to prepare a defense, but to assess vulnerability. The question was not what could be denied, but what could be proven. Documentation was reviewed, timelines checked, and the central concern became who knew what and when. In institutions that survive on precedent, records serve as both shield and liability. Security teams were looped in next, not because of an immediate threat, but to anticipate potential escalation. The palace understood how quickly situations could evolve once external forces sensed internal hesitation. The goal was to avoid reacting. That required anticipating how others might interpret silence or delay. Communication staff were given unusually restrained instructions. No proactive engagement, no background briefings, no corrective leaks. This departure from normal practice reflected uncertainty rather than confidence. When an institution is sure of its footing, it speaks quietly but clearly. When it is reassessing, it waits. Behind closed doors, the tone shifted further. There was acknowledgement that the palace had underestimated the moment, not the person, but the timing. Meghan had chosen a point when multiple pressures were converging and margins for error were already thin, making the warning harder to dismiss. What unsettled senior figures most was the clarity of implication. Meghan had not issued ultimatums or demanded action, yet the message was unmistakable. If the institution failed to adjust, it would own the outcome. Responsibility was placed back where it is least comfortable, inside decision-making rooms rather than press offices. There was also recognition that the power dynamic had changed. For years, the palace had operated under the assumption that distance equaled control and silence equaled containment. The call disrupted that logic, demonstrating that absence does not mean disengagement, and that information can move in ways the institution cannot command. As hours passed, the initial response solidified into recalibration. Plans were redrawn with contingencies, risk assessments updated, peripheral advisors brought closer, and others saw their influence reduced. None of this was announced. It was felt internally. The question shifted from whether to respond to how to avoid missteps. Emphasis moved from message to mechanism, with how decisions were made now outweighing how they would be explained. A rare but telling pivot. By day's end, nothing visible had changed. No leaks, no statements, no signals that anything had gone awry. Yet within the palace, the atmosphere was different. There was awareness that a line had been crossed not by Meghan, but by time itself. The institution now carried knowledge it could not unknow, and, with that knowledge came obligation. What it chose to do next would not simply shape headlines, it would define responsibility. And that realization lingered long after the phone went quiet. Meghan did not begin the call by recounting the past. There was no catalogue of grievances, no attempt to revisit old disputes, or Meghan did not reopen wounds that had already hardened. From the outset, she made clear that this conversation was not about what had been done to her. It was about what was about to happen if certain paths continued unchecked. Her tone was steady and deliberate, controlled, but resolute, as those listening later described it. There was no rush in her words, no emotional surge that could be dismissed as reaction. Instead, she spoke with the precision of someone who understood the consequences of every sentence. She outlined developments already in motion, not rumors or suspicions, but patterns she had observed forming across legal, media, and advisory spaces. She did not claim certainty, but she demonstrated awareness, signaling that this was informed concern rather than speculation. What unsettled the palace most was how she framed responsibility. Meghan did not accuse the institution of intent, malice, or conspiracy. Instead, she described how inaction and delay could produce outcomes that would appear intentional once exposed. In other words, she warned that silence could be misread as consent. That reframing shifted the weight of the conversation, placing accountability not on past behavior, but on future choice. The palace was no longer being asked to defend itself. It was being asked to decide what it would allow to unfold. She also made clear that time was not neutral. Every day without clarification increased risk, and each moment of hesitation created space for assumptions to solidify. She spoke of momentum as something that, once gained, becomes difficult to stop, a truth that resonated with those listening, who knew how quickly narratives become fixed once they escape internal control. Perhaps the most significant part of the call came when Meghan addressed the idea of burden. Without naming it directly, Meghan communicated that she would no longer carry the weight of consequences created by decisions made without her input. This was not presented as a threat, but as a boundary. She explained that for years she had done what was expected, remained quiet, stepped back, and allowed others to manage the narrative. But the conditions that made that possible no longer existed. Silence, she said, was no longer protective, it was harmful. In palace culture, Restraint is often interpreted as compliance, and Meghan disrupted that assumption, clarifying that restraint has limits, which had been reached not through conflict, but through accumulation. Small choices compounding over time into an untenable situation. She also corrected a key misunderstanding that had shaped internal thinking. The belief that distance meant disengagement, making it clear that stepping away did not equal ignorance or disinterest. She had been watching, listening, and understanding far more than the palace realized, forcing a recalibration of assumptions about where she stood and what she knew. Toward the end of the conversation, Meghan articulated what she was not asking for. No public statements, no gestures of reconciliation, no special treatment. What she sought was awareness and responsibility, ensuring the palace understood that if events unfolded in certain ways, it would be inaccurate to portray them as unforeseen. She was creating a record not for leverage, but for truth. The final moments of the call were quiet. There was no dramatic closing line, no emotional appeal. She simply reiterated that she had done what she believed necessary, and that what came next would depend on choices made inside those walls. When the call ended, those listening understood that something fundamental had shifted. Meghan had not changed the past, but she had changed the frame through which the future would be judged. That is what made the call impossible to ignore. It did not demand action, it demanded accountability. The fallout unfolded subtly. There were no sudden headlines, no dramatic reversals, no public acknowledgements that anything had changed. Yet within hours, the atmosphere surrounding the palace and its extended network shifted in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to those accustomed to reading between the lines. One of the first signs appeared in what did not happen. Planned conversations were delayed, expected briefings quietly postponed, and media inquiries that might normally have received carefully calibrated responses were met with polite silence. The palace response was not indecisive. It was a recalculation. Behind closed doors, advisors began reassessing positions that had previously seemed settled. Language that once felt firm was softened, and assumptions that had guided strategy were no longer treated as reliable. The call had introduced a variable that could not be ignored, forcing a re-evaluation of risk within the communication sphere. The shift was particularly noticeable. Long-standing media partners sensed hesitation, the usual rhythm of background guidance slowed, and sources who had once spoken with confidence became cautious. In an ecosystem built on predictability, that hesitation signaled internal uncertainty. The palace also began to examine how quickly information might travel beyond its control. Meghan had demonstrated that she was both informed and attentive, raising questions about who else might be watching and what conclusions they might draw from continued silence. The institution had always understood the danger of appearing reactive. Now it faced the equal danger of appearing willfully unaware. Legal considerations moved closer to the center of discussion. Advisors revisited documentation and decision trails, not because they anticipated immediate challenge, but because they recognized how narratives harden once scrutiny begins. The focus shifted from what could be explained to what could be substantiated, a distinction that mattered. Security teams monitored external developments more closely, not due to direct threat, but because of the potential for escalation once narratives intersected with public perception. The palace understood that moments of uncertainty can attract attention from actors with their own agendas, and caution became the default posture. What made the fallout particularly complex was that it unfolded without a clear endpoint. There was no single decision to reverse, no statement to issue that would resolve the tension. Instead, the institution navigated a series of smaller choices, each carrying weight. Speak or remain silent, clarify or defer, act now or wait. Each decision now measured against a new calculus. Internally, there was acknowledgement that the call had altered how Meghan was perceived. She was no longer seen primarily as a distant figure whose relevance diminished with time. She was recognized as someone engaged, informed, and capable of influencing outcomes without public confrontation. That realization forced a reconsideration of strategy. Distance alone was no longer sufficient, and silence was no longer neutral. The palace had to account for the possibility that inaction could be interpreted as disregard. Outside the palace, the ripple effects were equally telling. Commentators who typically spoke with certainty began to hedge. Narratives that had been gaining traction stalled or shifted tone, and the absence of reinforcement created space for alternative interpretations. In some cases, stories simply lost momentum. This was not coincidence. When institutions hesitate, ecosystems notice. The media may not know why, but it senses when confidence falters, and that subtle change influences coverage even without explicit direction. The fallout also reached advisors and allies operating on the periphery of palace influence. Conversations grew more guarded, assumptions were questioned, and some began preparing for outcomes previously dismissed as unlikely. What emerged was a kind of collective pause. No one wanted to move too quickly, no one wanted to be wrong. In that pause, the power dynamic continued to shift. Meghan had not issued a public statement, had not escalated, yet her influence was felt through the decisions others now hesitated to make. That is often how real leverage works. The palace found itself in an unfamiliar position. Instead of shaping the narrative, it was managing potential accountability. Instead of projecting certainty, it was weighing consequences. This did not mean weakness, but it did mean vulnerability. As days passed, the absence of outward change became its own signal, and the lack of clarity invited further scrutiny. The uncertainty created by the call did more than spark speculation, it prevented closure. Without resolution, attention lingered. Internally, some argued for decisive action, while others urged restraint. The debate was no longer about whether the call mattered. That was unquestioned. It was about how to respond without compounding risk. Every option carried trade-offs. Addressing the issue publicly could validate concerns and draw attention to matters best left unexamined. Remaining silent could allow narratives to form unchecked. Acting privately risked leaks. Doing nothing risked being seen as indifferent. In this environment, even routine decisions took on new significance. Timing was scrutinized, language passed, and the margin for error narrowed. Perhaps the most enduring effect was the shift in perception. Meghan was no longer positioned as someone reacting to events shaped by others. She was understood as someone capable of influencing the environment through awareness and timing alone. That change required no public acknowledgement to be effective. It altered how the palace considered future interactions, introducing caution where confidence had once prevailed, and reminding the institution that distance does not equal disengagement, and that silence does not always serve those who rely on it. By the time the full weight of the call was absorbed, one thing was clear. The fallout was not a moment. It was a process, and it was already underway. Nothing could go back. Inside institutions, there are rare moments when time splits into before and after. They are seldom announced, and do not arrive with ceremony or public acknowledgement. They reveal themselves slowly through altered behavior, cautious language, and decisions that feel heavier than they once did. This was one of those moments. After the call, the palace could not return to its previous assumptions. The belief that distance equaled closure no longer held, and the idea that silence could neutralize complexity had been quietly dismantled. What remained was awareness, and awareness carries obligation. The most significant change was not procedural but psychological. The institution now understood that Meghan was not a static figure in its past, but an active presence in its future, not because she sought to be, but because circumstances had aligned to make disengagement impossible. She had demonstrated when to speak and how to be heard, reshaping every subsequent calculation. Decisions that once felt routine were now examined for implication. Advisors asked different questions, not just how something would look, but how it would be interpreted later, not just whether a risk was manageable, but whether it was defensible. The lens had shifted from optics to record. Institutions feel the most pressure not from outrage or confrontation, but from history. The awareness that choices will one day be reviewed not in real time, but in hindsight. That awareness changes behavior. The palace faced an uncomfortable truth. By not acting sooner, it had allowed a gap to form between intention and outcome, and it is in that gap that narratives grow and accountability becomes blurred. Meghan had illuminated that gap without dramatizing it, making it impossible to ignore. What followed was neither reconciliation nor confrontation, but something quieter and more enduring. A recalibration of boundaries. The palace did not suddenly embrace. Transparency institutions rarely do, but it became more cautious about assuming control, recognizing that not all influence is visible, and not all power announces itself. Meghan had exercised influence simply by being precise, timely, and documented, and that realization lingered internally. There was acknowledgement that this moment would shape future interactions, not just with Meghan, but with anyone previously positioned at a distance. The call served as a reminder that absence does not erase involvement, and that people who step back are often still paying attention. There was also a shift in how silence was used. Previously a default response, it was now treated as a choice requiring justification. Silence could still be strategic, but it was no longer neutral. Every pause carried meaning. This change extended beyond the immediate circumstances, influencing how advisors framed risk and encouraging earlier intervention rather than delayed reaction. It reminded decision-makers that warnings are not always loud, and that the quiet ones are often the most consequential. For Meghan, the call marked a different kind of boundary. She had not reclaimed a role within the institution, nor sought validation or permission. What she reclaimed was agency. By speaking when she did, she ensured that her perspective was part of the record not as commentary, but as context. Context shapes judgment long after headlines fade. The call also altered how responsibility would be distributed going forward. No outcome could be framed as unforeseen, no development explained away as surprising. Awareness had been established, and with it, shared responsibility. Nothing goes back after this, not because of conflict, but because of clarity. Institutions can absorb criticism, withstand scandal, but what they struggle with is accountability that arrives before the damage is done. It removes the option of plausible distance and demands intention. The palace now operates under that constraint. What happens next will unfold quietly, as most institutional shifts do. Through policy rather than proclamation, caution rather than confidence, choices that reveal themselves only when compared to what might have been done before. Those watching closely will notice the hesitation where certainty once lived, the restraint where assumption once ruled, the awareness that someone outside the walls is paying attention, and that their attention matters. This is not the end of a story. It is the end of an illusion. The illusion that silence resolves complexity, that distance eliminates responsibility, that power flows only one way. After this moment, the palace knows better. And so does Meghan. Nothing returns to what it was before, because what was before depended on not knowing. Now they know, and knowledge changes everything. What happens next will not be announced loudly, but it will shape everything that follows. In times like this, silence is never empty, and awareness is the only advantage that lasts.